Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to Victorian England. The year is 1885, and two men have just locked eyes across a crowded theatre in the West End. One wears a green carnation in his buttonhole. The other recognises the signal. In 6 weeks, they will share a bed. In 6 months, one of them will be in prison. They had no dating apps, no safe spaces, no legal protection, just coded flowers, rented rooms, and the constant exhausting work of pretending to be something they were not. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight, we say their names out loud, because they could not. I am Julian, and this is Gay Timeline, the channel that brings forgotten gay history back into the light, one quiet night at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. Have you ever wondered what it was like to fall in love when the law called it a crime? Have you ever wondered how two men met in an age without pride parades or gay bars? How did they know? How did they signal interest without words? What did they say to each other in rented rooms at 3 a.m. when the rest of London slept? Have you ever thought about the letters they wrote, the ones they had to burn before anyone found them? What did those letters say? Have you ever wondered who held them when it all fell apart? Who was there in the courtroom when the judge handed down the sentence? Have you ever asked yourself what courage looked like before the word gay even existed? What did love cost when everything, your reputation, your freedom, your life, depended on keeping it secret? Tonight, you are about to find out. Let us begin with the flower, the green carnation. Dyed, not natural. You could buy one from a flower girl outside the Criterion or the Café Royal for 6pence. Oscar Wilde made it famous, but he did not invent it. By the late 1880s, wearing one was a quiet announcement. Not loud, not obvious to everyone, but to those who knew, it was a beacon. The Victorian gay world ran on signals like this: a certain way of holding a cigarette, a particular cafe at a particular hour, the tone you used when you asked a man if he had read a certain book, a glance held half a second too long. The question was not whether you were attracted to men. The question was whether you knew the code. And knowing the code meant you had been taught it. Introduced. Brought into the circle by someone who already belonged. The historian Matt Cook, working through the records of late Victorian London, found dozens of cases where men described their first encounter with another gay man as a moment of recognition. Not seduction, recognition. The relief of realizing you were not the only one. Before you could date, you had to find each other. And in an age before the internet, before gay bars, before any visible community, finding each other required an entire underground infrastructure. Let me walk you through it. London in the 1880s and 1890s had perhaps 200,000 men. A reasonable guess, based on population records, is that somewhere between 5 and 10% identified, at least privately, as attracted to other men. That gives you 10 to 20,000 men. But how many of those were visible? How many knew where to go? The answer is, they built their own map. Certain public toilets, called cottages, became known meeting spots. The one near the Alhambra Theatre, the one in Hyde Park near the Serpentine, the one at Piccadilly Circus beneath the street. Men loitered there longer than necessary, made eye contact, exchanged a few words, sometimes nothing more. Sometimes an address scribbled on a card. Risky, incredibly risky. Plainclothes police officers patrolled these spots looking for exactly this behavior. The law called it gross indecency, a term so vague it could mean almost anything. A touch, a proposition, a lingering glance. The 1885 Labouchere Amendment made all sexual acts between men, public or private, punishable by up to 2 years of hard labour. Even before that, Sodomy carried a potential death sentence until 1861. After 1861, life imprisonment. So why risk it? Because the alternative was a life spent entirely alone. Because human beings will risk almost anything for connection. Because when you have spent years thinking you are the only person in the world who feels this way, the moment you discover you are not is worth the danger. The theatres were safer. The Alhambra, the Empire, the Gaiety, all had promenades where men and women walked during the interval. But certain men walked there for other reasons. They lingered at the bar. They struck up conversations. The actor and diarist John Addington Symonds described his first visit to the promenade at the Alhambra as terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. He did not know if the man beside him was a threat or a possibility. But the man smiled, asked if Symonds had seen the new production at the Lyceum, mentioned casually that he lived nearby. That was all it took. Symonds wrote later, in his private memoirs, that he felt as though he had stepped through a door he did not know existed. On one side, the world he had known his entire life, where men married women, and desire was never spoken. On the other side, this, a world of glances and half-sentences and unspoken understanding. A world that had always been there, running parallel to the visible one, waiting for him to find it. Let us pause here and name what we are talking about. This is not speculation. This is documented. The trials alone, and there were hundreds, preserve the details. Men testified about where they met, what was said, who introduced them. The Cleveland Street scandal of 1889 exposed an entire male brothel operating in plain sight, with clients ranging from telegraph boys to aristocrats. The transcripts of that case, preserved at the National Archives, list names, addresses, and described meetings in excruciating detail. H. Montgomery Hyde spent years combing through those records for his work on Victorian homosexuality. What he found was not a scattering of isolated incidents. He found a network, a community, men who knew each other, who protected each other, who warned each other when the police were watching. It was not a community that could gather openly. There were no gay pubs, no pride marches, no newsletters, but it was a community nonetheless. Word of mouth, letters passed hand to hand, invitations to private parties that never named their purpose outright. The solicitor and writer Edward Carpenter hosted gatherings at his cottage in Derbyshire. Men travelled hours by train to attend. They ate, they talked, they slept under the same roof without fear, at least for one night. Carpenter wrote later that these gatherings felt like stealing time from a world that wanted them dead. He was not exaggerating. So you have found the map. You know where to go. You have made eye contact with a man at the Alhambra, and he has smiled back. Now what? Now comes the most delicate part. The negotiation. You cannot simply ask, "Are you like me?" That question, spoken aloud, could destroy both of you. So you talk around it. You mention a book, Carpenter's Towards Democracy, Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Both were known in certain circles as texts that spoke to men like you. If he has read them, and if he responds with enthusiasm, you have your answer. If he has not, you change the subject and disappear into the crowd. The writer E.M. Forster, decades later, remembered this dance with a mixture of nostalgia and rage. He wrote that gay men of his generation became the best conversationalists in England because they had to be. They learned to say one thing and mean another, to flirt without flirting, to extend an invitation that could be dismissed as innocent if it was refused. If the other man understood, the conversation continued. You might arrange to meet again, same place, same time next week. Or he might suggest a walk, Hyde Park at dusk, Hampstead Heath on a Sunday afternoon, far enough from prying eyes that you could talk freely. Or he might invite you back to his rooms, if he lived alone, if he had a landlady who did not ask questions. This was the goal: privacy, a locked door, a space, however temporary, where you did not have to pretend. Let us follow one particular man through this process. His name was John, and he worked as a clerk in the city. We know him because he was arrested in 1892 and the details of his case were reported in the newspapers. Not his full name, just his first name and his occupation. But his story is typical. John was 26. He had known he was attracted to men since he was 15, but he had never acted on it. He assumed he was alone. He kept his head down. He worked. He ate his meals in boarding houses. He went to church on Sundays. He was, by all appearances, exactly what Victorian society wanted him to be. Then one evening, walking home through Piccadilly, he saw another man standing near the fountain. The man caught his eye, held it, smiled. John panicked and walked away, but the next evening, he went back. The man was there again. This time, John nodded. The man approached, asked if John had the time. John checked his pocket watch, told him. The man thanked him, then asked if John might like to get a drink. They went to a pub, not one known for this sort of thing, just an ordinary pub where clerks and shopkeepers gathered after work. They talked about the weather, about work, about nothing in particular. Then the man asked if John had ever been to the theatre. John said no. The man said he had an extra ticket for Saturday. Would John like to go? John said yes. Saturday came. They met outside the theatre, watched the play, walked afterward. The man, whose name was Arthur, mentioned he lived nearby, said he had a bottle of wine if John wanted to continue the conversation. John understood what was being offered. He said yes again. What happened in Arthur's rooms that night is not recorded in the trial transcript. What is recorded is that they continued to meet, every Saturday for 3 months. John told his landlady he was visiting a cousin. Arthur told no one. Then Arthur was seen by a neighbour. The neighbour reported him to the police. The police waited until John arrived the following Saturday, then knocked on the door. Both men were arrested. Both were charged with gross indecency. Both were sentenced to 18 months of hard labour. John's story is extraordinary only in that we know it. For every case that went to trial, there were hundreds that did not. Men who met, who fell in love, who built entire lives around Saturday evenings and locked doors and the constant, gnawing fear of discovery. The fear was not irrational. Between 1885 and 1900, over 1,000 men were prosecuted under the gross indecency law. The historian Geoffrey Weeks documented this in his work on Victorian sexuality. 1,000 men, in 15 years. In a society where most gay men never came to the attention of the authorities at all, which means the visible prosecutions represent a fraction of the actual number of relationships. For every John and Arthur caught by a nosy neighbour, there were 10 couples who were more careful, who never invited anyone back to their rooms, who met in rented spaces, paying by the hour, who used false names, who burned every letter. The wealthier you were, the easier it was to hide. If you had money, you could rent your own flat, hire servants who were loyal or indifferent, travel to Paris or Berlin, where the laws were slightly less draconian. You could join certain gentlemen's clubs where everyone understood the situation and no one asked questions. Oscar Wilde had all of these advantages, and still he ended up in Reading jail. Wilde is the most famous Victorian gay man, and for good reason. Not because he was unusual, because he was visible. He refused to hide. He wore the green carnation. He brought his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, to public dinners. He wrote plays that coded queer desire into nearly every line. And when Douglas's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, accused him of being a sodomite, Wilde sued for libel. Catastrophic decision. The trial exposed everything. Letters, witnesses, hotel staff who testified they had seen Wilde with young men. The jury took 2 hours to convict him. He was sentenced to 2 years of hard labour. He served the full term. When he was released in 1897, he was bankrupt, ill, and exiled. He died 3 years later in a cheap Paris hotel room. The writer Neil Bartlett spent years researching Wilde and the world he moved through. What Bartlett found was that Wilde's conviction sent a shockwave through gay London. Men who had been relatively open suddenly vanished. Parties stopped. Known meeting spots emptied. The fear was palpable. If Oscar Wilde, wealthy and famous and beloved, could be destroyed, then no one was safe. But here is the thing. The community did not disappear. It went further underground. Men became more careful. The signals became subtler. But they kept meeting. They kept falling in love. Because the alternative, a life of complete isolation, was worse than the risk. Let us talk about what happened after that first meeting. After John said yes to Arthur's invitation. After the door closed and they were alone. First, relief. The relief of not having to pretend. Of being able to sit beside another man without calculating the distance between your bodies. Of being able to look at him without glancing away after 2 seconds. Then conversation. Real conversation. About everything you could not say out loud in ordinary life. About what it felt like to grow up thinking you were the only one. About the exhaustion of performing normalcy every single day. About whether you would ever be able to live openly. About whether that was even imaginable. And then, if both men wanted it, physical intimacy, a hand on a shoulder, a kiss, more if the trust was there. But even this came with layers of caution. What if the other man was an informant? It happened. The police recruited men to entrap others. They called them agents provocateurs. A man would approach you, flirt, invite you somewhere private. Then, once you had incriminated yourself, reveal his true purpose, arrest, trial, prison. So trust had to be built slowly. First meeting, just talk. Second meeting, maybe a touch. Third meeting, maybe more. You watched for signs. Did he ask too many questions? Did he seem nervous? Did he know the names of others in the community, or was he isolated? If he passed these tests, if the relationship continued, then you entered a new phase. You became a couple. Not in any legal sense. Not in any way the outside world would recognize. But between yourselves, yes, you were together. Some couples lived together, posing as roommates. Shared lodgings were common enough among bachelors that no one questioned it, as long as you maintained separate bedrooms for appearances. Others continued to live apart, meeting once or twice a week in rented rooms or at one partner's flat. The letters between these men, the ones that survived, are breathtaking. Edward Carpenter and George Merrill wrote to each other constantly when apart. Carpenter's letters are preserved at the Sheffield Archives. They are love letters in every sense. He writes about missing Merrill's touch, about counting the days until they can be together again, about building a life, however constrained, that felt true to both of them. John Addington Symonds wrote hundreds of letters to various men over his lifetime. Many were destroyed, but some survived. In one, written to a younger man named Norman, Symonds describes lying awake at night thinking about their last meeting, about the way Norman laughed, about the shape of his hands. The letter is dated 1889. Symonds was nearly 50. Norman was 23. The age gap alone would have scandalized Victorian society, never mind the gender of the people involved. But what comes through in these letters is not scandal. It is tenderness. These men loved each other. They used the language of friendship because they had no other language available. They called each other my dear friend or my companion. But the subtext is always there. I love you. I need you. I cannot imagine my life without you. The question of sex is tricky. The Victorians were obsessed with it and terrified of it in equal measure. The law criminalized it. The church condemned it. Medical authorities pathologized it. And yet, men kept doing it. What acts, specifically? The records are vague, deliberately so. The term gross indecency could cover anything from mutual masturbation to anal sex. Sodomy, in legal terms, meant penetrative anal sex. But the vast majority of prosecutions were for gross indecency, not sodomy. Which tells you that most gay relationships involved a range of physical intimacy, much of it non-penetrative. This makes sense. Penetrative sex required privacy, time, and a level of comfort that many men never achieved. But kissing, touching, shared nudity, all of this was possible even in risky circumstances. And for many men, it was enough. The closeness mattered more than the specific acts. We know this because men testified about it. In trial after trial, witnesses described what they saw or what they were asked to do. The testimony is clinical, stripped of emotion by the legal process. But between the lines, you can see the relationships. Men who had known each other for years, who met regularly, who clearly cared for each other. One case from 1895 involved two men who had been meeting for a decade. Every Thursday evening. Same time, same rented room. The landlady finally reported them. When the police asked why she had waited so long, she said she had not been sure. They seemed so ordinary, so quiet. It was only when a new constable moved into the neighborhood and started asking questions that she felt obligated to say something. 10 years. Every Thursday. They were creatures of habit, which is oddly touching. They had built a routine, a piece of normalcy in a world that denied them the possibility of normal. The trial records do not say what happened to them after sentencing, but we can guess. 18 months to 2 years of hard labor, then release into a world that now knew what they were. No chance of returning to their old jobs, no chance of rebuilding their reputations. Many men in this situation simply disappeared, changed their names, moved to another city, started over as someone else. Others did not survive. The suicide rate among men convicted of gross indecency was staggering. The shame was unbearable. The isolation was unbearable. Some men took their own lives within weeks of release. But some survived. Some found each other again. Some built new lives, quieter and more hidden than before, but lives nonetheless. The human capacity for resilience is extraordinary. Even in the face of a society that wanted you erased, some men refused to be erased. The question of marriage comes up constantly when people learn about Victorian gay relationships. Did any of them get married? To each other? Obviously not. Marriage was legally defined as between a man and a woman. But some gay men did marry women, not because they wanted to, because the pressure to do so was overwhelming. A bachelor in his 30s was suspicious. A bachelor in his 40s was a source of gossip. If you wanted to maintain respectability, you married. You produced children. You performed the role of husband and father. And you conducted your real emotional and sexual life elsewhere, in secret. Some wives knew. Most did not. The ones who knew either accepted it because they too were trapped by social expectations, or they were quietly miserable. Divorce was possible but scandalous and ruinously expensive. So they stayed. And their husbands continued to meet men in rented rooms. Oscar Wilde married Constance Lloyd in 1884. They had 2 sons. By most accounts, Wilde loved Constance in his way. But his primary emotional and sexual attachments were to men. Constance knew, eventually. After the trial, she changed her name and took the children to Europe. She never saw Wilde again. Did Wilde regret marrying her? We do not know. What we do know is that marriage, for many gay Victorian men, was another form of hiding, another performance, one more exhausting role they had to play to survive. The other option was to remain unmarried and simply endure the speculation. Some men managed this. They became known as confirmed bachelors. The term was polite code. Everyone understood what it meant, or at least suspected. But as long as you were discreet, society tolerated you. Edward Carpenter was a confirmed bachelor for most of his adult life. Then, in his 40s, he met George Merrill, a working-class man from Sheffield. They moved in together. They lived openly as a couple, or as openly as was possible. Carpenter had independent wealth, which helped. He did not need employment. He did not need to maintain respectability in any conventional sense. So he and Merrill ran a small farm together in Derbyshire, and visitors came from all over England to meet them. E.M. Forster visited in 1913. He later wrote that seeing Carpenter and Merrill together, living a life that was both domestic and openly affectionate, changed everything for him. He had assumed such a life was impossible, that gay men were condemned to secrecy and loneliness forever. But here were two men who had built something real, a home, a partnership. It was not legal, it was not recognized, but it existed. Forster went home and began writing Maurice, a novel about two men who fall in love and choose each other over respectability. He never published it in his lifetime. Too dangerous. But he wrote it. The act of imagining happiness, even on paper, mattered. Carpenter and Merrill were unusual. Most gay couples did not have the resources or the courage to live openly. But their existence proved it was possible. That gave other men hope. The knowledge that somewhere two men were waking up in the same bed every morning without fear, even if you could never do the same, made the hiding slightly more bearable. Let us return to the mechanics of dating. You have met someone. You have begun seeing each other regularly. Now comes the question of logistics. Where do you go? What do you do? Some couples walked, long walks through parks or along the river. Walking allowed conversation without the need to sit face to face in a public place where you might be observed too closely. You could talk for hours. You could walk side by side, close enough that your hands occasionally brushed. If you were very bold and very sure no one was watching, you might hold hands for a few seconds. Hampstead Heath was popular for this, far enough from central London that you were unlikely to encounter anyone you knew, large enough that you could find secluded spots. The historian Matt Cook found references to Hampstead Heath in dozens of personal letters and diaries from the period. Men arranged to meet there. They walked. They talked. Sometimes they found a hidden grove and kissed. The risk was always present. Even on the heath, even in secluded spots, you could be discovered. There were reports of blackmailers who lurked in known cruising areas, waiting to catch men in compromising positions. They would threaten to report you to the police unless you paid. Many men paid. The alternative was ruin. One particularly vicious blackmailer, a man named Alfred Taylor, operated in London throughout the 1890s. He rented rooms and invited young men to stay there, then extorted older men who visited. When the police finally arrested him in connection with the Oscar Wilde case, they found records of dozens of victims. Men who had paid him hundreds of pounds over the years to keep their secrets. Taylor was sentenced to 2 years of hard labour, the same sentence given to his victims when they were caught. The irony was not lost on anyone. The law was supposed to protect people. Instead, it created an entire ecosystem of predators who fed on fear. But let us focus on the relationships that survived these dangers, the couples who managed to stay together despite everything. What did their lives look like? Routine was essential. You met on the same day every week, same time, same place. Routine minimized risk. If you varied your schedule, you increased the chance of being noticed. But if you were simply a man who always visited his friend on Tuesday evenings, well, that was unremarkable. You developed a cover story. He was your cousin, your old school friend, your colleague from work. You rehearsed this story until it was automatic. If anyone asked, you could recite it without hesitation. The story had to be plausible, but vague. Too much detail invited scrutiny. You were careful about letters. If you wrote to each other, you used neutral language. My dear friend, not my darling. I enjoyed our conversation, not I cannot stop thinking about kissing you. Some men developed elaborate codes. Certain words meant certain things. A reference to the weather might actually be an invitation. A mention of a book title might be a declaration of love. John Addington Symonds and his friend Henry Graham used a code based on classical literature. When Symonds wrote about Plato, he was really writing about his feelings for Graham. When he referenced Socrates and Alcibiades, he was describing their relationship. Anyone reading the letters would see only scholarly discussion. But Graham understood. This coding extended to published literature as well. Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray is a novel about a beautiful young man and the older men who desire him. It is not explicitly gay. It could not be. But every gay man who read it in 1890 recognized himself in it. The critic Walter Pater called it dangerous. The newspapers called it immoral. Wilde, characteristically, called it a work of art and declined to explain further. When Lord Alfred Douglas wrote poetry about his love for other men, he used classical references, Greek love, Uranian love, terms that allowed plausible deniability. He could claim he was writing about philosophy, not autobiography. But again, those who knew, knew. This constant need for deniability was exhausting. Every word had to be calculated. Every gesture had to be controlled. You could never fully relax, even with your lover, because the possibility of discovery was always there. Some men broke under the strain. They withdrew entirely, stopped meeting anyone, lived in complete isolation. Others threw caution aside and became reckless. They frequented known cruising spots. They picked up strangers. They took risks that almost guaranteed eventual arrest. Most men fell somewhere in between. They were careful, but not paralyzed. They built small, manageable lives around their relationships. Tuesday evenings, a rented room, an hour or two of genuine connection. Then back to the performance. Let us talk about class. Because class shaped everything in Victorian England, and gay relationships were no exception. If you were upper class, you had options. You could travel. You could maintain a flat in London and a country house. You could employ servants who were loyal or who turned a blind eye. You could afford bribes if things went wrong. Oscar Wilde's downfall was partly about class. He was upper middle class pretending to be aristocracy, and when he sued the Marquis of Queensberry, he was challenging someone with more power and resources. It destroyed him. If you were middle class, a clerk or a shopkeeper or a schoolteacher, you had fewer options but more anonymity. You lived in a city where no one knew your business. You could rent a room without questions. You could meet someone in a pub without your family hearing about it. But you also had less money. Renting rooms cost money. Paying blackmailers cost money. If you lost your job due to scandal, you had no safety net. If you were working class, everything was harder. You lived in close quarters, shared lodgings, thin walls, nosy neighbours. Privacy was nearly impossible. The public toilets and parks were your only option for meeting others, and those spaces were heavily policed. The majority of men arrested for gross indecency were working class. Not because working class men were more likely to be gay, because they were more likely to be caught. And yet, working class gay relationships existed. We know this from the trial records. 2 factory workers arrested in a rooming house in Manchester. 2 sailors discovered in a ship's hold in Portsmouth. 2 farm labourers caught in a barn in Devon. The records are brief, just names, occupations, sentences. But each entry represents a relationship. 2 men who found each other despite impossible odds. Edward Carpenter and George Merrill were unusual partly because they crossed class lines. Carpenter was educated, middle class, independently wealthy. Merrill was working class, barely literate when they met. Carpenter taught him to read. They built a life together that defied every social convention of the era. Carpenter wrote about this in his work on homosexuality and society. He argued that gay relationships often crossed class boundaries in ways that heterosexual relationships could not. When the relationship itself was already illegal, other social taboos seemed less important. You had already broken the biggest rule. Why not break the others? Not everyone agreed with this. Some middle-class gay men would only pursue relationships within their own class. The risk of blackmail was lower. The cultural gap was smaller. But Carpenter believed that gay love, precisely because it was outlawed, had the potential to be more egalitarian than straight love. He might have been overly optimistic. Class still mattered, but his relationship with Merrill proved it was possible to build something across that divide. Let us talk about age gaps, because they were common. Older men with younger men, sometimes much younger. This makes modern readers uncomfortable, and it should. But we have to understand the context. In Victorian England, adolescence as we understand it did not really exist. You were a child until puberty, then you were an adult. Boys started working at 12 or 13. They lived in adult spaces. They were expected to navigate adult relationships. When an 18-year-old telegraph boy had a sexual relationship with a 40-year-old aristocrat, the Victorians saw this primarily as a class issue, not an age issue. The scandal was that an aristocrat was sleeping with someone so far beneath his station. The age gap was barely remarked upon. This does not make it acceptable by modern standards. It makes it important to understand what gay dating looked like in this context. Relationships between older and younger men were common, partly because older men had resources, money, privacy, experience navigating the dangers. Younger men had fewer options and less knowledge of the underground world. Some of these relationships were exploitative. The Cleveland Street scandal involved boys as young as 15 being paid for sex with older men. When the scandal broke, the public outrage focused on the corruption of innocent youth. The boys themselves were treated as victims by some, accomplices by others. Several were prosecuted. But other relationships between older and younger men were more equal, or as equal as any relationship could be in that context. John Addington Symonds was in his late 40s when he met Norman, who was in his early 20s. Their letters suggest genuine affection on both sides. Norman was not being coerced. He sought out the relationship. He continued it for years. The poet and critic Walter Pater had a series of intense friendships with younger men throughout his life. Were these romantic? Sexual? The evidence is ambiguous. Pater was extraordinarily careful. He never left explicit evidence. But the emotional intensity of his letters to certain young men suggests something more than mentorship. This pattern, older mentor and younger protégé, was one of the few socially acceptable frameworks within which two men could have a close relationship. As long as it appeared to be about education or career advancement, no one questioned it. Many gay men used this framework as cover for actual romance. E.M. Forster later wrote about this in his personal notes. He described how his relationship with a younger man began as tutoring and evolved into love. The structure of mentorship gave them time alone together without suspicion. They could meet in Forster's rooms to discuss literature. They could take long walks to talk about philosophy. And within that framework, they fell in love. Let us shift to the question of language. What did Victorian gay men call themselves? What did they call their relationships? The word homosexual was not coined until 1869 by an Austro-Hungarian writer named Carl Maria Kertbeny. It did not enter common English usage until the 1890s, and even then, it was a medical term, not an identity label. Victorian gay men did not call themselves homosexuals. Some used the term Uranian, derived from Plato's Symposium. Uranian love meant love between men. It was classical, respectable. It allowed you to talk about your feelings without using crude language. A small community of writers and activists adopted this term in the 1890s. They published pamphlets and poems under titles like Uranian Verses. Others used the term invert. This came from sexology, the emerging scientific study of sexuality. An invert was someone whose gender feelings were inverted, a man with a woman's soul or vice versa. This language seems odd now, even offensive. But for many Victorians, it was the only framework available for understanding themselves. If you felt attracted to men, the medical authorities told you this was because your inner gender was female. Many men accepted this explanation because it was the only one offered. Edward Carpenter rejected the inversion model. He argued in his writing that love between men was not a medical condition. It was a natural variation. He called it the intermediate sex, a third category between male and female. This was progressive for its time, though it still relied on a gender binary that modern queer theory has largely moved beyond. Most men, though, did not use any of these terms in everyday conversation. They used euphemisms: a particular friend, a close companion, someone who understands. If you told another gay man that you had a particular friend, he knew what you meant. If you mentioned that your friend understood you in ways others did not, the subtext was clear. In letters, men used the language of romantic friendship. This was socially acceptable between men as long as it remained non-physical. You could write about your deep emotional bond. You could describe missing your friend intensely. You could even use phrases like, "I love you," as long as the love was framed as spiritual rather than carnal. The trick was that no one could definitively prove where the line was. How do you distinguish between passionate but chaste friendship and a romantic relationship? You cannot, not from the outside. So men used romantic friendship as cover. They wrote letters that sounded exactly like the letters straight men wrote to close friends. But the meaning between the lines was different. John Addington Symonds wrote a famous letter to a friend where he laid out his philosophy of male love. He described it as the highest form of friendship, one that included physical affection but transcended it. The letter could be read as purely philosophical, or it could be read as a declaration of his own desires. The ambiguity was deliberate. This ambiguity frustrates historians. When we read Victorian letters between men, we often cannot be certain whether the relationship was sexual. The language is the same either way. But for the men writing those letters, the ambiguity was protective. If your letter was intercepted, if it was read by the wrong person, you could plausibly deny any sexual intent. You were just very good friends. Let us turn to the practicalities of physical intimacy. Where did it happen? How did men manage it? Rented rooms, as I have mentioned, were the most common solution. But renting a room for an hour or two was not always straightforward. Some boarding houses catered specifically to gay men. Everyone knew what they were for, but no one said it aloud. You paid the landlady. She gave you a key. You went upstairs with your companion. An hour later, you left. No questions asked. The historian Maurice Kaplan documented several of these establishments in his research on Victorian London. One on Cleveland Street, which gave its name to the scandal. Another near the British Museum. A third in Bloomsbury. They operated in plain sight for years before police raids shut them down. Hotels were riskier. Hotel staff were trained to notice irregularities. Two men checking in together without luggage would attract attention. But some men managed it. They booked separate rooms, then one would visit the other. Or they claimed to be travelling together for business. As long as they maintained the appearance of propriety in public, hotel staff usually looked the other way. Private homes were safest if you had them. If you lived alone, or with a partner you trusted, you could invite someone over without elaborate pretense. But most men did not live alone. They lived with family or in shared lodgings. Privacy was a luxury. This is why parks and public spaces were so important, despite the risks. If you had nowhere else to go, you went to the park. You found a secluded spot. You took your chances. The number of men arrested in public spaces is staggering. Hyde Park, Regent's Park, Hampstead Heath, Green Park. Every major park in London saw regular arrests. The police knew these were meeting spots. They patrolled them specifically for this purpose. Yet men kept going. Because the need for human connection, for touch, for intimacy, was stronger than the fear. Some men were caught multiple times. The records show repeat offenders, men who served 6 months, were released, and were arrested again within a year. Each time the sentence was longer. Each time the conditions were harsher. And still they went back. Why? Because the alternative was unbearable. Because a life without any physical affection, without ever being touched by another person in love, is not really a life. The risk of prison seemed worth it for 1 hour of being held. Let us talk about what happened when relationships ended. Because they did end. Not all of them. Some couples stayed together for decades, until death separated them. But many relationships ended, and the ending was often devastating. If you were in a heterosexual relationship and it ended, you had a social framework for processing it. You told your friends. They comforted you. You mourned publicly, in acceptable ways. You eventually moved on and sought someone new. If you were in a gay relationship and it ended, you had none of that. You could not tell your friends why you were heartbroken. You could not explain why you were suddenly withdrawn and miserable. You had to grieve in secret, just as you had loved in secret. The writer John Addington Symonds experienced this after a relationship ended abruptly when his lover married a woman. Symonds was devastated. He wrote in his private memoir that he felt as though a part of himself had died. But he could not tell anyone. He maintained his public persona. He continued his scholarly work. He socialized. And in private, he fell apart. Breakups happened for many reasons. One partner decided the risk was too great and withdrew. One partner married to satisfy family pressure. One partner was arrested and the other cut contact to avoid being implicated. One partner simply met someone else. There was no way to enforce monogamy in these relationships. They were not marriages. There was no legal or social contract. If your lover decided to pursue someone else, you had no recourse. You could not confront him publicly. You could not demand fidelity. You could only accept it. Some men did maintain long-term monogamous partnerships. Edward Carpenter and George Merrill were together for nearly 30 years. But they were exceptional. Most gay relationships were shorter, more fragile. The constant pressure from outside made it nearly impossible to build lasting stability. And yet, men tried. They wrote letters promising eternal devotion. They exchanged gifts, rings sometimes, worn on chains under their shirts where no one could see. They created private rituals, anniversaries only they knew about, inside jokes, pet names used only when alone. These small acts of intimacy, of claiming the relationship as real, even when the world denied it, were acts of resistance. They were saying, "This matters. You matter to me. We matter." The loneliness when it ended must have been crushing. To lose the one person who knew you fully. To return to a life of complete pretense. To know you could not even speak his name aloud without risking everything. Some men never recovered. They withdrew from the underground community entirely. They lived out their lives alone, never risking connection again. Others tried again, met someone new, built something new, knowing it might end the same way, but hoping it would not. Let us discuss the role of alcohol in gay social life. Pubs and bars were essential meeting places, but they were also dangerous. Drinking lowered inhibitions. Men said things they should not say, did things they should not do, and the police knew this. Certain pubs became known as gay-friendly. The landlord either was gay himself or simply did not care. These pubs provided a rare space where men could gather without constant fear. You still had to be careful. You could not be openly affectionate, but you could sit with other men who understood. You could have conversations that hinted at your real life. You could feel, for a few hours, less alone. The Café Royal in Piccadilly was one such place. Oscar Wilde held court there. He sat at his usual table surrounded by beautiful young men, and everyone knew what was happening. But as long as it remained verbal, as long as no one touched anyone in public, the management tolerated it. After Wilde's conviction, the Café Royal became less welcoming. The scandal had made everyone nervous. Other establishments stepped in to fill the gap. The Crown in Charing Cross, the Fitzroy Tavern in Bloomsbury. These were not exclusively gay spaces. They were mixed. But everyone knew that if you were a man looking for the company of other men, you could find it there. Alcohol also played a role in private encounters, Dutch courage. Men drank to quiet their nerves before meeting someone. They drank to blur the guilt afterward. They drank to forget the constant fear. The trial records frequently mention alcohol. Two men met in a pub. They drank together. One invited the other back to his rooms. They drank more. Then something happened that led to arrest. The alcohol did not cause the attraction, but it enabled the acting on it. Some men struggled with drinking. The pressure of living a double life, the constant anxiety, the inability to be honest with anyone, drove some men to drink heavily. Edward Carpenter wrote about this in his memoirs. He described men he had known who drank themselves to death rather than face their desires or the consequences of acting on them. But alcohol was also social glue. Sharing a drink was an acceptable reason for two men to spend time together. You met for a pint after work. No one questioned it. And in that hour at the pub, you could have a conversation. You could make eye contact. You could see if there was a spark. If there was, you could suggest continuing the evening elsewhere. The careful dance of courtship often began in pubs. The first meeting in a park or public toilet was furtive, anxious, transactional. The second meeting, over drinks, was where you learned whether this was just physical or something more. You talked. You discovered if you had anything in common beyond desire. If you did, a relationship might develop. If you did not, you parted ways and hoped to find someone else. Let us talk about what happened when you fell in love, because that did happen, despite everything. Men fell genuinely, deeply in love with each other. This was not just physical attraction or convenience, it was love. The letters make this undeniable. When John Addington Symonds wrote to his lovers, he described feelings that anyone who has ever been in love would recognize. The way his heart raced when he saw them. The way time stopped when they were together. The way everything else in his life felt less real than those moments. He wrote that falling in love with another man felt like waking up for the first time, like his entire previous existence had been sleepwalking. Edward Carpenter described meeting George Merrill as the moment his life began. He had lived 40 years before that meeting, accomplished years, productive years. But he wrote that nothing felt fully real until he met George. Suddenly, he understood what poets had been writing about for centuries, the completeness of finding your other half. Oscar Wilde wrote obsessively about Lord Alfred Douglas. His letters are almost painful to read because the love is so obvious and so doomed. He called Douglas Bosie. He wrote that life without Bosie was colourless, that every beautiful thing he saw made him think of him, that he would give up everything, his career, his reputation, his freedom, just to be with him. And he did. He literally did. When Douglas's father accused Wilde of being a sodomite, Wilde could have left the country. His friends begged him to. They bought him a ticket to France. But he stayed because Douglas asked him to. Because love, even love that would destroy him, felt more important than survival. This is what falling in love looks like when the world tells you your love is a crime. It becomes everything. It has to be everything because you are risking everything for it. The intensity of these relationships was partly circumstantial. When you can only see each other once a week, every meeting carries enormous weight. When every touch might be your last before one of you is arrested, you memorize it. When you have to hide your feelings from everyone else in your life, the person who knows the truth becomes your entire world. This intensity could be beautiful. It could also be destructive. Some relationships became obsessive, possessive, jealous. When your lover is the only person you can be honest with, the thought of losing him is unbearable. Men made desperate, irrational decisions. They threatened to expose each other if one tried to end things. They followed each other. They showed up uninvited. They wrote letters that, if discovered, would destroy both of them. The dynamic between Oscar Wilde and Lord Alfred Douglas exemplifies this. Their relationship was passionate, volatile, and ultimately catastrophic for Wilde. Douglas was young, beautiful, reckless. He did not care about consequences the way Wilde should have. He pushed Wilde to be more open, more defiant. When Douglas's father attacked Wilde, Douglas urged him to fight back, to sue for libel, to defend his honor. Wilde, who was older and should have known better, let love override judgment. He sued. The trial exposed everything. Letters between Wilde and Douglas were read aloud in court. Hotel staff testified. Young men testified. The evidence was overwhelming. Wilde lost the libel case and was immediately arrested on charges of gross indecency. Douglas, whose recklessness had started the whole disaster, faced no charges. He was aristocracy. Wilder was not. The law protected Douglas and destroyed Wilde. After Wilder went to prison, Douglas wrote him letters. Some were affectionate, some were cruel. Wilde eventually wrote back a long letter called De Profundis, where he tried to make sense of what had happened. He still loved Douglas, but he also understood that the relationship had destroyed him. Not all love stories ended this badly. Some were quiet and lasted decades, but the intensity was a common thread. When you cannot love openly, when every expression of love is an act of defiance, love becomes overwhelming. Let us talk about the physical spaces where gay couples spent time together. I have mentioned parks and rented rooms, but there were other places, specific neighborhoods, specific streets. If you knew where to look, you could find small pockets of relative safety. Bloomsbury was one such area. It attracted artists, writers, intellectuals, people who were already living slightly outside conventional society. The boarding houses there were more relaxed. The landlords asked fewer questions. 2 men sharing lodgings in Bloomsbury was unremarkable. The neighborhood had a reputation for bohemianism, which provided cover. Edward Carpenter's cottage in Derbyshire became a pilgrimage site for gay men in the 1890s and early 1900s. Men travelled from London specifically to visit. They stayed for a weekend. They met others like themselves. They talked openly for the first time in their lives. Carpenter and George Merrill created a space that felt safe as anywhere could feel in that era. E.M. Forster, after his visit, corresponded with Carpenter for years. He called the cottage a glimpse of what life could be. He wrote that seeing 2 men living together, openly affectionate, doing ordinary domestic things like gardening and cooking meals, gave him hope. If it was possible for Carpenter and Merrill, maybe it was possible for others. But most men did not have access to spaces like that. They lived in conventional neighborhoods. They worked conventional jobs. They navigated conventional social expectations. They found moments of freedom in transient spaces. A hired cab where you could sit close to each other for 10 minutes. A train compartment, if you were lucky enough to have it to yourselves. A corner of a museum on a quiet afternoon where you could stand side by side, looking at a painting and let your hands touch. The National Gallery was mentioned in several diaries from the period as a meeting place. You arranged to be there at the same time. You wandered separately through the galleries. You ended up in front of the same painting. You struck up a conversation about the art. If anyone observed you, they saw 2 men discussing Titian. They did not see what was actually happening. The eye contact held a second too long. The way you positioned yourselves so your shoulders touched. The plans being made in half sentences. Same time next week? Museums and galleries had another advantage. They were respectable. If anyone asked what you did with your afternoon, you could say you went to see the new exhibition at the National Gallery. Art appreciation was an acceptable hobby for a gentleman. No one questioned it. The British Museum was particularly popular. Vast, easy to get lost in. You could spend hours there without it seeming odd. The Egyptian galleries were a favourite. Dimly lit. Fewer visitors. You could linger in front of a sarcophagus and have a quiet conversation. You could arrange to meet in the reading room, both of you pretending to research something, and exchange notes. The reading room of the British Museum appears in multiple accounts from gay men of the era. It was a place where intellectual men congregated, so two men being there together was unremarkable. But it also had long tables and alcoves where you could sit near each other, where you could pass a note, where you could arrange to leave at the same time and walk out together. Churches, oddly, also served this purpose, not during services. But churches were open throughout the day. You could go in, sit in a pew, pretend to pray. If another man was there, you could sit near him. You could both leave after a few minutes and end up on the street at the same time. It was plausibly accidental. And churches felt safe because they were holy spaces. Surely nothing improper would happen in a church. The irony, of course, is that the church was one of the institutions most violently opposed to gay love. The Church of England condemned it. Priests preached against it. And yet, the physical buildings, open and public, provided temporary refuge. Let us discuss what happened during the limited time couples had together. An hour in a rented room, an evening in someone's flat, a weekend at a cottage in the country. What did they actually do? They talked. This cannot be overstated. Gay Victorian men were starved for honest conversation. You spent your entire life performing a role, censoring yourself, never saying what you really thought or felt. When you were finally alone with someone who understood, the relief of being able to speak freely was profound. They talked about their lives, their families, their fears. They talked about what it felt like to know you were different from everyone around you. They talked about whether it would ever get better, whether the laws would ever change, whether they would ever be able to live openly. They also talked about ordinary things, work, books, politics, the same things any couple talks about. Because despite the extraordinary circumstances, they were still just two people trying to build a connection. Physical intimacy, when it happened, was often tentative, especially in new relationships. You did not know how much the other person wanted. You did not know what they were comfortable with. You had to negotiate without being able to have explicit conversations about it. Because even in private, the language for talking about gay sex did not really exist. So you moved slowly, a hand on a shoulder. If that was welcomed, a hand on a knee, a kiss, then more, if both people wanted it. But always with an awareness that if you misjudged, if you pushed too far, the other person might panic, might leave, might, in the worst case, report you. Trust had to be established over time. First meeting, maybe just talking. Second meeting, maybe a kiss. Third meeting, maybe more. You watched each other's reactions. You learned what they wanted and what they did not. You developed a physical language between you. The men who stayed together for years developed deep intimacy. They knew each other's bodies. They knew what brought pleasure. They were comfortable enough to experiment, to try things, to laugh when something did not work. This is what the trial transcripts never capture. The tenderness, the playfulness, the moments of genuine joy. Edward Carpenter wrote obliquely about this in his published work. He argued that physical love between men was not just about sex. It was about a kind of intimacy that transcended the physical, that the body was a way of communicating something deeper. That touch was a language. This might sound like Victorian euphemism, a way of making sex sound spiritual to make it more acceptable. But reading Carpenter's private letters to George Merrill, you see he meant it literally. He described lying in bed with George, their bodies entwined, and feeling a kind of completeness. He described sex as a form of worship, not in a religious sense, but in the sense of honoring the other person, of saying with your body what you could not say in words. Not everyone experienced physical intimacy this way. For some men, sex was just sex, a physical need met with another person, a release, a moment of pleasure. Nothing more profound than that. And that was fine too. Not every gay relationship was a grand love affair. Some were casual, some were transactional. Some were about loneliness more than desire. You met someone because being with anyone was better than being alone. The trial records include these relationships too. Men who picked up strangers, who went to public toilets looking for quick, anonymous encounters, who never learned each other's names, who met, did what they came to do, and parted. Modern readers sometimes judge this harshly. Surely real relationships, committed relationships, are superior to anonymous hookups. But in a context where committed relationships were nearly impossible, where the risk of discovery increased with every repeated meeting, anonymous encounters made sense. They were safer in some ways. No names, no addresses, no evidence. Just two men in a dark corner who would never see each other again. And some men preferred it that way. They did not want the emotional complexity of a relationship. They just wanted physical release. The Victorian obsession with sexual purity applied to gay men too. Society expected you to be celibate if you were unmarried. But human desire does not work that way. So men found ways to meet their needs without the entanglement of emotions. Let us return to the question of what couples did beyond sex. Because relationships, even risky illegal relationships, were about more than physical intimacy. They read to each other, books that meant something to them, poetry especially. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass was almost a Bible for gay Victorian men. Whitman wrote openly about the love of comrades, about male bodies, about desire. His language was coded but unmistakable. Reading Whitman aloud to another man was a form of courtship. It was saying, I see you. I understand what you are. They shared meals. If one of them could cook, he cooked. They sat across from each other at a small table and ate together. This seems mundane, but it was not. Eating together is intimate. It is domestic. It is what couples do. For men who could never be a couple in any public sense, sharing a meal in private was significant. It was pretending, for an hour, that this was your real life. That you came home to this person every night. That you belonged to each other. They made plans, imaginary plans mostly. What they would do if the laws changed, where they would live, the house they would buy, the life they would build. These conversations were fantasies. They knew that. But fantasizing together created a shared world. Even if that world only existed in their imaginations, it was theirs. Some couples did make real plans. Edward Carpenter and George Merrill planned their cottage. They chose it together. They furnished it together. They made it a home. That was extraordinary and rare, but it happened. For most couples, the planning stayed imaginary, but it still mattered. It was a way of saying, I want a future with you, even if we cannot have it. They also fought. Of course they fought. Every couple fights. But gay couples in this era could not fight the way straight couples could. You could not raise your voice. The walls were too thin. The neighbors might hear. You could not storm out. Someone might see you leave and wonder why you were there in the first place. You had to fight quietly, intensely, in whispers. And you could not threaten to leave the way people in conventional relationships could. Because leaving meant going back to complete isolation. It meant losing the only person who knew you. So fights had a different quality, more desperate, higher stakes. You could not afford to let anger destroy what you had because what you had was so rare and so fragile. Lord Alfred Douglas was famously difficult. He had a temper. He was jealous. He picked fights with Oscar Wilde constantly. Wilde, who adored him, endured it. He wrote about it later with a mixture of exasperation and affection. He described Douglas throwing things, screaming at him. Then, an hour later, collapsing into tears and begging forgiveness. It was exhausting. It was also the only relationship Wilde had where he could be fully himself. Not all relationships were this tumultuous. Many were quiet and steady. Two men who met every Thursday for 10 years, as I mentioned earlier. They probably fought occasionally. They probably had moments of frustration. But mostly, they had routine. And routine, in a world of constant uncertainty, was precious. Let us talk about holidays and special occasions. Christmas, birthdays, anniversaries. How did gay couples mark these? They could not celebrate together openly. If you disappeared on Christmas Day, your family would notice. So most men spent holidays with their families, performing the role of dutiful son or brother. Then, a few days later, they would meet their partner, exchange gifts privately, have their own belated celebration. The gifts had to be carefully chosen, nothing too personal, nothing that would require explanation if someone saw it. Books were safe, everyone gave books. You could inscribe it to my dear friend with no one questioning it, but you could choose a book that had private meaning, a volume of poetry you had read together, a novel where you had underlined certain passages. Some men gave jewelry, a ring worn on a chain under your shirt, cufflinks, practical and unremarkable, a pocket watch inscribed on the inside where no one else would look. These objects became talismans, physical proof that the relationship existed, that you were not imagining it. Edward Carpenter and George Merrill celebrated their anniversary every year, the anniversary of the day they met. They did not tell anyone else what they were celebrating, but they marked it, a special meal, a walk to a place that was meaningful to them, a private acknowledgement that they had survived another year together. For couples who could not live together, anniversaries were bittersweet. A reminder of how long you had been together, but also a reminder of how much longer you would have to hide. 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. How many more years until you could stop pretending? Birthdays were similarly complicated. If your lover was turning 30 or 40, you wanted to celebrate, to make him feel special. But you could not throw him a party. You could not invite friends, because your friends did not know about him. So you celebrated alone. You gave him a gift. You told him how much he meant to you, and you went home separately, as always. Some men wrote letters for special occasions, letters they never sent, letters that said everything they could not say out loud. I love you. I want to spend my life with you. I wish we could wake up together every morning. These letters were hidden away. Some were destroyed when the writer died. Some survived and ended up in archives, where historians found them a century later. One such letter, written by a man named Robert to his lover Charles in 1893, is preserved at the London School of Economics archives. Robert wrote it for their 5th anniversary. He described every detail of the day they met, the cafe where it happened, what Charles was wearing, the exact moment Robert knew he was in love. He wrote that the last 5 years had been the happiest of his life, despite everything. Despite the hiding and the fear and the knowledge that it could all end at any moment. The letter ends with Robert promising to love Charles for the rest of his life. Whether that was 5 more years or 50, whether they could ever live openly or not. He wrote that loving Charles was the most real thing he had ever done. That everything else in his life felt like a performance, but this was true. Robert died in 1901. Charles lived until 1934. We do not know if they stayed together. We do not know if Charles ever read that letter or if Robert kept it hidden. We only know the letter survived. And that is something. Let us discuss the impact of Oscar Wilde's trial on ordinary gay couples. The trial happened in 1895. It was front-page news for weeks. Every newspaper in the country covered it. The details were lurid. The testimony was explicit. Everyone in England knew what a sodomite was by the time the trial ended. For gay men, it was terrifying. If Oscar Wilde, famous and wealthy and charming, could be destroyed, then anyone could be. The message was clear. No amount of talent or success or respectability would protect you if you were exposed. In the months after Wilde's conviction, arrests for gross indecency increased. The police were emboldened. The public was outraged. Judges handed down harsher sentences. Men who might have gotten 6 months before the trial were now getting 2 years. But the trial also had an unexpected effect. It made gay life visible. Before Wilde, most people outside the gay underground did not know it existed. They assumed gay men were rare, isolated. After the trial, everyone knew there was a whole world of men loving men, meeting in secret, building relationships. For some gay men, this visibility was empowering. It meant they were not alone. It meant there were others. The trial exposed the network. Suddenly, men who had thought they were the only one realized there were thousands like them. This led to a strange paradox. Immediately after the trial, gay life in London became quieter. Men were more careful. Meeting places emptied. Parties stopped. But within a few years, new spaces opened up. New meeting places were established. The community had not been destroyed. It had just moved deeper underground and become more organized. Some historians argue that the Wilde trial was actually a catalyst for the eventual gay rights movement. That by making gay existence visible, however negatively, it created the possibility of collective identity. Before Wilde, gay men thought of themselves as individuals with a shameful secret. After Wilde, they began to think of themselves as a group, a community, people with shared experiences and shared oppression. Edward Carpenter certainly saw it that way. He increased his public advocacy after the trial. He wrote more openly about homosexuality. He argued that the laws were unjust. He tried to build solidarity among gay men. He knew it was dangerous. But he also knew that silence had not protected Oscar Wilde. If you were going to be persecuted anyway, you might as well fight back. Not everyone agreed with this approach. Most gay men wanted to stay hidden. They saw what happened to Wilde and decided the best strategy was invisibility. Keep your head down, do not make noise, survive. Both approaches are understandable. Carpenter had privilege. He had money. He did not need a job. He could afford to be visible. Most men could not. They had families, employers, reputations. They chose survival over visibility. But Carpenter's visibility mattered. It gave other men hope. It showed that resistance was possible, and it laid the groundwork for future activists who would eventually change the laws, though that would not happen for another 70 years. Let us talk about what happened when one partner died, because death was common in Victorian England. Disease, accidents, the brutal conditions of prison if you were unlucky enough to be convicted. When your partner died, you had no legal standing, no right to grieve publicly, no claim to anything that had belonged to him. If a man died and left behind a male partner, that partner was invisible to the law. The family inherited everything. They cleared out his rooms. They took his possessions. They buried him. And you, the person who had loved him, who had spent years of your life with him, were expected to show up to the funeral, if you were invited at all, and pretend to be merely a friend. You could not weep openly. You could not explain your devastation. If people asked why you seemed upset, you said he was a good friend. You kept your grief measured, appropriate. Anything more would raise questions. Some men did not survive this. The grief combined with the isolation was too much. We know from obituaries and death records that some men died within months of their partners. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia or heart failure. But reading the private correspondence that survived, you see what really happened. They gave up. They stopped eating. They stopped caring. They let themselves die. Edward Carpenter wrote about this in his memoirs. He described attending the funeral of a man he knew was gay, watching the man's partner stand at the back of the church, silent and grey-faced. After the service, the partner approached Carpenter, asked if they could speak privately. They walked to a nearby park. The partner told Carpenter that he and the deceased had been together for 15 years. 15 years. They had shared a home, shared a life. And now he had nothing. The family had barred him from the house. They had burned all the letters. The partner asked Carpenter what the point was of going on. If the person you loved was gone, and no one even acknowledged that you had loved him, what was the point? Carpenter did not have a good answer. He told the man that grief fades with time. that he would find a way to survive. But even as he said it, he knew how hollow it sounded. That partner died 6 months later. The obituary said he succumbed to influenza. Carpenter knew better. Not every story ended this way. Some men did survive the death of their partners and eventually found love again. But the grief was compounded by the erasure. It is one thing to lose someone. It is another thing to have that loss dismissed. To be told your grief is inappropriate because, as far as anyone knows, he was just a friend. Let us talk about the letters that were destroyed, because the destruction of evidence was constant and deliberate. Gay men knew their correspondence could destroy them, so they burned letters. They ripped them up. They threw them into rivers. They buried them. Some men asked their partners to destroy letters after reading them. Do not keep this. It is too dangerous. Others kept letters but hid them carefully, in locked boxes, in secret compartments, behind false walls. A few men, the ones with resources, rented safe deposit boxes at banks specifically to store letters from their lovers. This is why the archive of gay Victorian relationships is so sparse. We have Oscar Wilde's letters because he was famous and people preserved them despite the scandal. We have John Addington Symonds's letters because he entrusted them to friends who understood their historical importance. We have Edward Carpenter's letters because he lived long enough to see attitudes beginning to shift, and he chose to preserve them deliberately as evidence. But for every letter that survived, hundreds were destroyed. Thousands. Entire relationships vanished because the evidence was burned. We will never know how many men loved each other in Victorian England. We only know about the ones who got caught or the ones who took the risk of preserving the evidence. The historian Matt Cook has tried to estimate the number of gay relationships in Victorian London by working backward from trial records, population statistics, and surviving documents. His best guess is that at any given time in the 1880s and 1890s, there were between 5,000 and 10,000 men in London who were in or seeking same-sex relationships. In a city of 5 million, that is a small percentage, but it is not insignificant. 5,000 to 10,000 men, each with his own story, his own loves, his own heartbreaks. Most of those stories are gone. We are left with fragments, a name in a trial transcript, a brief mention in a diary, a single letter that escaped destruction. This erasure was not accidental. It was the point. Victorian society wanted gay men to disappear. It wanted to erase any evidence that they had ever existed, and to a large extent it succeeded, but not entirely, because some evidence survived. And from those fragments, we can reconstruct what life was like. We can say their names. We can tell their stories. We can refuse to let them be forgotten. Let us talk about the men who transitioned from secret relationships to open ones, or as open as was possible. Edward Carpenter was the most prominent example. He lived openly with George Merrill for decades. But there were others. Charles Keynes Jackson was a lawyer and editor who lived with a younger man named Ralph Blakelock in the 1890s. They did not hide their relationship from friends. They invited people to dinner. They travelled together. They presented themselves as a couple. This was possible partly because Keynes Jackson moved in bohemian circles, artists and writers who were more tolerant, and partly because he had money. He did not depend on conventional employment, but even Keynes Jackson faced consequences. He was dismissed from his position at the Artist magazine after his relationship with Blakelock became too visible. Advertisers complained, readers complained. The publisher decided Keynes Jackson was a liability. He lost his career because he refused to hide. Another example is John Gambrel Nicholson, a schoolteacher and poet. He wrote openly homoerotic poetry under his own name. He published it in small literary magazines. He made no attempt to disguise what he was writing about. This was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. He lost his teaching position. He was blacklisted from respectable employment. He spent the last decades of his life in poverty. But he kept writing. He kept publishing. He argued that gay love was beautiful and natural, that the laws were wrong, that history would eventually vindicate him. He died in 1931, decades before the laws changed. He never saw himself proven right, but he planted seeds. These men, the ones who chose visibility, paid a heavy price. But they also changed things. They made it possible for the next generation to imagine something different. They proved that survival was possible even without hiding completely. Most men, though, did not have the option of visibility. They had to stay hidden. And for them, dating meant navigating an impossible maze of risk and desire. Let us return to the practical question of how men actually met each other for dates. I have described the initial meeting, the cautious approach, the exchange of information. But what about the second date, the third? How did you build something ongoing? You established a schedule. Same place, same time, every week. This minimized risk. If someone saw you in the same location twice, it looked like routine. Routine was unremarkable. But if you were seen in different places at different times, it looked suspicious. You used intermediaries when possible. If you had a friend who was also gay and trustworthy, you could leave messages with him. You did not write letters directly to each other. Too dangerous. But you could write to your mutual friend. Ask him to pass along a message. This added a layer of protection. If the message was intercepted, it would not lead directly to your lover. You developed signals. If you wore a particular color tie, it meant you could meet. If you wore a different color, it meant something had come up and you could not. You walked past a certain window at a certain time. If the curtain was open, it meant come up. If it was closed, it meant stay away. These signals seem paranoid, but they were necessary. The police were actively looking for gay men. They staked out known meeting places. They followed suspected gay men. They opened mail. They questioned neighbors. The surveillance was real and constant. One man, whose story appears in trial records from 1891, was arrested because a postman noticed he was receiving letters with handwriting that matched letters going to another address. The postman reported this to the police. The police intercepted the letters. They contained nothing explicitly sexual, just affectionate language. My dear friend, I look forward to seeing you. Entirely innocent on the surface, but the police used the letters to justify surveillance. They watched both men. They followed them to a rented room. They arrested them both. At trial, the letters were presented as evidence of a relationship. The jury convicted based on the affectionate tone alone. No physical evidence was needed, just the implication. This case set a precedent. After that, gay men knew that even carefully worded letters were dangerous. The solution was to stop writing entirely or to be so vague that the letters conveyed nothing useful. I hope you are well. Perhaps we might meet soon. That was all you could safely say. This made maintaining relationships incredibly difficult. How do you sustain emotional intimacy when you cannot write honest letters? When you can only meet once a week for an hour? When every conversation in public has to be coded and careful? The answer is that many relationships did not survive. The constraints were too great. Men met. They fell in love. Then the logistics defeated them. One of them moved to another city for work, or got married to a woman, or decided the risk was too great, or simply drifted away because the effort of maintaining the connection was exhausting. The relationships that did survive were the ones where both men were deeply committed, where they made the relationship a priority despite the obstacles, where they decided that the happiness they found together was worth the constant fear. Let us talk about the geography of gay life in other British cities beyond London. Because while London was the centre, Gay relationships existed throughout England. Manchester had its own underground. The industrial cities of the north had large working-class populations living in close quarters. Factory workers, miners, men who shared lodgings. The opportunities for same-sex relationships were different than in London, but just as real. The port cities, Liverpool, Bristol, Portsmouth, had transient populations. Sailors who came and went. This created spaces where anonymity was possible. You could meet a sailor in a pub, spend the night together. He would ship out the next morning. No names, no ongoing relationship, just a moment of connection. Brighton was known as a more permissive city. It was a resort town. Wealthy people went there to escape London. The social rules were slightly more relaxed. Some gay men moved to Brighton specifically because it was easier to live there. You could rent a flat with a male companion and face fewer questions than you would in other cities. University towns, Oxford and Cambridge, had their own particular dynamics. Young men living in all-male environments. Close friendships that sometimes became more. The universities officially condemned homosexuality, but the reality was that it was common. Tutors and students, students with each other. The architecture of university life, shared rooms, late-night conversations, intense intellectual and emotional bonds, created conditions where gay relationships developed. Many of these relationships ended when the men left university and entered conventional adult life. They married, they took jobs, they put their university romance into a category of youthful experimentation. Not real, not who they actually were. But some men never moved on. They spent the rest of their lives trying to recapture what they had at university. The intensity, the intimacy, the sense that they were known fully by another person. John Addington Symonds had several intense relationships at Oxford. One in particular, with a younger student named Alfred Brooke, shaped the rest of his life. They read poetry together. They walked along the river at dusk. They talked about Plato and the ancient Greeks and whether love between men was noble or shameful. The relationship was probably not physical. Symonds wrote later that he did not even kiss Brooke, but the emotional intensity was overwhelming. When Brooke graduated and left Oxford, Symonds fell into a depression that lasted months. He felt as though part of himself had been torn away. He spent the next 40 years seeking that same connection. He married a woman, had children, maintained a respectable life. But his real emotional life was a series of relationships with younger men. Some were consummated physically, some were not. But all of them were attempts to recreate what he had felt at Oxford with Alfred Brooke. This pattern was common. University relationships became a template. The first time you loved someone freely, before the full weight of adult respectability descended, became the ideal you measured everything else against. And nothing ever quite measured up because the circumstances were never the same. Let us discuss what happened when relationships crossed national boundaries. Because some British gay men travelled to Europe specifically to find more freedom. Paris was more tolerant than London. The laws in France were less harsh. There were cafes where gay men could gather openly. Certain neighbourhoods, particularly around Montmartre, had visible gay communities. British men with money travelled to Paris for weekends or extended stays. They could be themselves there in ways they could never be in England. Oscar Wilde spent his final years in Paris after his release from prison. He lived in cheap hotels. He met other gay men at cafes. He had relationships, brief and mostly unsatisfying. He was famous and notorious and broke, but he could at least live openly as a gay man. In England, that would have been impossible even if he had not been convicted. The social ostracism would have been total. Berlin was another destination. Germany had its own gay subculture. The sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld was based in Berlin and advocated publicly for gay rights. There were gay bars, gay publications, an organised community. British men read about this and travelled there to see it for themselves. Edward Carpenter visited Berlin multiple times. He met Hirschfeld. He attended lectures on homosexuality as a natural variation rather than a disease. He brought back ideas and books that he incorporated into his own writing. He tried to argue that what was possible in Berlin could eventually be possible in England. Italy was popular for different reasons. The Italian attitude toward male affection was more relaxed. Men could walk arm in arm. They could embrace in public. British gay men travelling in Italy felt a sense of freedom they never felt at home. The physical warmth of Italian culture provided cover for affection that would have been suspicious in England. John Addington Symonds spent much of his later life in Switzerland and Italy. He wrote that the Mediterranean sunlight and the Italian temperament made him feel alive in ways England never had. He had relationships with Italian men, including a gondolier in Venice named Angelo Fusato. The relationship lasted years. It was partly romantic, partly transactional, partly a friendship. Symonds supported Angelo financially. Angelo provided companionship and physical intimacy. This dynamic, older wealthy British man with younger working-class local man, was common among British gay travellers. The power imbalance is uncomfortable to modern eyes, but for the men involved, it was often the only way to have any kind of relationship. Symonds was open about the fact that he paid Angelo. He did not pretend otherwise, but he also genuinely cared for him. When Angelo married a woman and had children, Symonds continued to support the family. The relationship shifted, but did not end. These international relationships allowed British gay men to experience something closer to normalcy. You could walk through a piazza in Florence with your arm around another man. You could sit at a café terrace in Paris and hold hands across the table. You could not do that in London, ever. But these trips were temporary. Eventually, you had to go home. Back to England. Back to hiding. The freedom you tasted abroad made the constraints at home feel even more unbearable. Some men never came back. They settled in Paris or Berlin or Rome. They built lives there. They sent letters to family in England, making excuses about why they were staying abroad. Work opportunities, health reasons, the climate, anything but the truth. The truth was that they could not go back to pretending. Once you had experienced living openly, even partially openly, you could not unsee that possibility. So you stayed abroad. You became an exile. You gave up your country for the chance to be yourself. Let us return to the question of sexual practices, because this is important for understanding what dating actually involved, and because the Victorians themselves were obsessed with categorizing and pathologizing sexual acts. The sexologists of the era, men like Havelock Ellis and Richard von Krafft-Ebing, wrote extensively about homosexuality. They documented case studies. They classified types. They debated whether it was a disease or a congenital condition or a moral failing. Their work is often bizarre and offensive by modern standards. They described gay men as inverts who had female souls trapped in male bodies. They catalogued sexual acts in clinical detail. They recommended treatments ranging from cold baths to hypnosis to surgical intervention. But their work also had an unintended effect. It made information available. Gay men read these medical texts, looking for any information about themselves. They read Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis, even though it described them as pathological. They read Havelock Ellis's Sexual Inversion. They read anything that acknowledged their existence, and in these texts, they found descriptions of what other men did, what was physically possible, what other people desired. For men who had grown up in complete ignorance, this information was valuable even when it came wrapped in medical disapproval. Edward Carpenter read the sexologists and then wrote his own response. His pamphlet, The Intermediate Sex, argued that homosexuality was natural, that gay men were not diseased, that they were simply a third sex, as valid as male or female. His work was radical for its time. It suggested that gay men had nothing to be ashamed of. Carpenter also wrote more explicitly about sexual practices in manuscripts that were not published until after his death. He described his physical relationship with George Merrill. He wrote about anal sex, about mutual masturbation, about oral sex. He wrote about these acts, not as pathology, but as expressions of love, as ways that two people communicated intimacy. His willingness to write about this openly, even in private manuscripts, was extraordinary. Most gay men could not even think about these acts without shame. They had been taught that their desires were sinful, that physical intimacy with another man was the worst thing a person could do. Overcoming that shame required enormous psychological work. Some men never managed it. They had sex, but hated themselves for it. They sought out physical contact, but then spiraled into guilt afterward. This internal conflict was devastating. Other men found ways to integrate their sexuality into their sense of self. They decided that what they felt was natural to them, that acting on it was not wrong, that the shame belonged to the society that condemned them, not to themselves. This was the position Edward Carpenter took. He wrote that gay men needed to reject the shame society imposed, that they needed to build their own ethics, that love between men was beautiful and life-affirming and nothing to apologize for. Not many men in the Victorian era could fully embrace this perspective, but some did. And for those who did, sexual intimacy became something other than shameful. It became joyful, a source of connection and pleasure and mutual affirmation. Let us talk about the role of art and culture in gay courtship, because the arts provided a language for things that could not be said directly. Music was important. Certain composers were understood to be gay. Tchaikovsky. Certain pieces of music became coded. If you invited someone to a concert and suggested listening to a particular work, you were making a statement. If he responded with enthusiasm, you had your answer. Theatre, as I mentioned earlier, was a meeting place. But it was also more than that. The theatre itself, the plays and performances, provided material for coded conversations. You could discuss a play's subtext, the relationship between two male characters, the actor who played a romantic role with particular intensity. These discussions were ostensibly about art, but they were really about you. Oscar Wilde's plays are full of this. The Importance of Being Earnest has been read by scholars as a play about double lives, about maintaining one identity in public and another in private, about the elaborate deceptions required to pursue what you actually want. Every gay man in the audience understood exactly what Wilde was really writing about. Visual art provided similar opportunities. You could visit a gallery together, stand in front of a painting of male nudes, discuss the beauty of the male form in objective aesthetic terms. But the subtext was obvious. You were saying, I find men beautiful. Do you? Certain artists became icons for gay men. Michelangelo, Caravaggio, Simeon Solomon, a contemporary British artist who painted homoerotic subjects and was eventually arrested and destroyed by scandal. Gay men sought out Solomon's work. They bought prints. They hung them in private spaces where they could look at images of male beauty and desire. Literature was perhaps most important. Books could be read in private. You could underline passages. You could give a book to someone as a gift, knowing they would understand why you chose it. Certain books became part of the gay canon before there was such a thing as a gay canon. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, as I mentioned. The poetry of the ancient Greeks, especially Plato's Symposium. Shakespeare's sonnets to the young man. The Persian poetry of Hafez and Rumi, which celebrated male beauty. Edward Carpenter's own poetry and essays. Oscar Wilde's Everything. These books were lifelines. If you were a young man just beginning to understand your own desires, finding Whitman could change everything. Reading his lines about the love of comrades, about bodies electric, about adhesiveness between men, you realized you were not alone. Someone else had felt this. Someone had written it down. Someone had published it for the world to see. Gay men shared these books with each other. It was a form of courtship. If you lent someone your copy of Leaves of Grass and he returned it with certain passages marked, you knew he understood. You knew he was like you. The book became a conversation you could not have any other way. Some men wrote their own poetry and shared it only with their lovers, private verses that no one else would ever read. These poems have mostly been lost, but occasionally one surfaces in an archive. A scrap of paper tucked inside a book. A few lines that express love so directly, so vulnerably, that you feel the writer's fear and courage both. One such poem, found in the papers of a man named Thomas who died in 1897, describes his lover's hands. The way they moved when he talked. The way they felt against Thomas's face. The way they gripped his own hands when they walked together at night. The poem is tender and specific and completely unself-conscious. Thomas wrote it for an audience of one. He never imagined anyone else would read it. The fact that it survived is miraculous. Most of these private documents were destroyed. Families burned them. Executors burned them. The men themselves burned them before they died, knowing that discovery would destroy their reputations even posthumously. But a few survived, and they give us glimpses into the emotional reality of these relationships. Let us talk about religion, because for many Victorian men, religious faith was central to their lives. And religious faith created enormous internal conflict for gay men. The church taught that homosexuality was a sin, not just any sin, one of the worst sins. Sodomy was traditionally listed alongside murder and blasphemy as crimes that cried out to heaven for vengeance. Sunday after Sunday, gay men sat in pews and heard themselves condemned. Some men internalized this completely. They believed they were sinful. They prayed for God to change them. They begged for deliverance from their desires. They tried everything: fasting, cold baths, avoiding situations where they might be tempted, marrying women in the hope that heterosexual marriage would cure them. Nothing worked. The desires remained. The psychological damage this caused is hard to overstate. You grow up believing that God made you, that God loves you. Then you discover that you are something God supposedly hates. How do you reconcile that? Some men could not. They lost their faith entirely. Others developed a tortured relationship with religion, believing and doubting in equal measure. A few men found ways to reinterpret Scripture. They argued that the biblical prohibitions were about pagan temple prostitution, not loving relationships between equals. They pointed to David and Jonathan, Ruth and Naomi, the centurion and his servant. They looked for any evidence that God might not actually condemn them. Edward Carpenter rejected Christianity entirely. He became interested in Eastern religions, particularly Hinduism and Buddhism, which he felt were more accepting of diverse forms of love. He argued that Christian sexual ethics were life-denying and destructive, that a religion based on love should not condemn people for loving. But most gay Victorian men could not simply abandon Christianity. It was too deeply embedded in their culture, their families, their sense of identity. So they lived with the contradiction. They went to church, they prayed, and they loved men. And they did not know how to make those things fit together. Some found sympathetic clergy, liberal-minded priests who quietly counseled that God's mercy was greater than the church's judgment, that God saw the heart, that a loving relationship, even between two men, was better than loneliness or a loveless marriage. These clergy took enormous risks. If their superiors discovered they were offering such counsel, they could be defrocked. One such priest, whose name is lost, but whose story is preserved in a letter from John Addington Symonds, told Simons that he believed God made some men to love other men, that this was part of the natural order, that the sin was not the love, but the cruelty with which society treated such men. Simons wrote that this conversation gave him peace for the first time in years. The idea that he might not be damned, that God might actually accept him as he was. This priest had no theological backing for his position. The official doctrine was clear. But he chose mercy over doctrine. He chose the person in front of him over abstract rules. For Simmons, this made all the difference. Let us discuss what happened when families discovered a man was gay, because this did happen, not often, but often enough. Sometimes a man was arrested and the trial was reported in the newspapers. The family read about it there. Sometimes a letter was found. Sometimes a servant reported something suspicious. Sometimes the man himself confessed, unable to bear the lying anymore. The family's reaction varied. Some families cut off all contact. The man was disowned. His name was never spoken again. He ceased to exist as far as the family was concerned. This happened to Oscar Wilde. His wife changed her name and took the children. They never saw him again. His brother stopped speaking to him. Other families tried to fix the situation. They sent the man to doctors. They pressured him to marry. They moved him to another city, away from bad influences. They did everything possible to suppress the truth. A few families, a very few, quietly accepted it. They did not approve, but they did not disown. They maintained contact. They helped financially if the man was in trouble. They visited him in prison if he was convicted. These families were extraordinary. They chose love over respectability. One such family was the Blunts. Their son Wilfred was probably gay, though he married and maintained a public facade. When he was discovered in a compromising situation with another man, the family quietly settled the matter, paid off the potential blackmailer, moved Wilfred to the country, never discussed it. But they did not abandon him. He remained part of the family. This was unusual and generous. Most families chose reputation over relationship. The shame was too great. The social consequences were too severe. They could not risk being associated with a known homosexual. So they cut ties, and the man was left completely alone. This abandonment by family compounded every other loss. You had already lost your lover, either to arrest or fear or circumstance. Now you lost your family too. You lost your past. You lost everyone who had ever known you. You became a ghost in your own life. Some men survived this. They built new families, found other gay men who became brothers, lovers, friends, created chosen family that replaced the biological family that rejected them. Edward Carpenter and George Merrill's household became a kind of family for many gay men who had been cast out by their own families. They visited. They stayed for weeks. They found acceptance. But the loss of biological family was still painful. You grieved for it, even as you built something new. You wondered if your mother thought about you, if your siblings remembered you, if they mourned you, or were relieved you were gone. Let us talk about the economic realities of gay relationships, because money shaped everything, as it always does. If you were wealthy, you had options. You could maintain your own residence. You could travel. You could afford bribes if necessary. You could hire lawyers if you were arrested. Wealth did not make you immune to prosecution, as Oscar Wilde discovered. But it provided resources that most men did not have. If you were middle class, you had to be careful with money. Renting rooms cost money. Paying for discretion cost money. If you lost your job due to scandal, you had no safety net. Many middle-class gay men lived one accusation away from complete financial ruin. If you were working class, every penny mattered. You could not afford to rent rooms. You could not afford to travel. You met in public spaces because they were free. You took risks that wealthier men could avoid because you had no choice. This created a strange economy within the gay world. Wealthier men sometimes financially supported younger, poorer men. This could be genuine generosity. It could also be exploitative. The line between supporting a lover and paying for sex was often unclear. The Cleveland Street scandal exposed this dynamic. Telegraph boys, working-class teenagers, were paid by wealthy clients for sex. The boys needed the money. Their families were poor. The wages they earned legitimately were barely enough to survive. The extra income from the brothel made a real difference to their lives. Were they victims? Were they sex workers exercising agency? The answer is probably both. The power imbalance was real. The economic desperation was real. But so was the boys' willingness to participate. They knew what they were doing. They made a choice, constrained though it was. Victorian society saw them primarily as corrupted innocents. The focus was on the wealthy men who had led them astray. The boys themselves were treated as passive victims. This was not entirely accurate, but it was the only framework available. In more equal relationships, money was still a factor. Who paid for dinner? Who paid for the rented room? If one partner earned significantly more, did he pay for everything? Did the other partner resent this? Feel obligated? Feel kept? These questions arise in any relationship with income disparity. But they were more fraught in gay relationships because the relationship itself was illegal. There was no cultural script for how to navigate this. Heterosexual couples had engagement, marriage, clear expectations about financial roles. Gay couples had to figure it out themselves. Some couples kept finances completely separate. Each paid his own way. This felt more equal, but also more businesslike. It created emotional distance. If you were splitting the cost of a rented room, it felt transactional, less romantic. Other couples pooled resources. One paid rent, the other bought food. They shared expenses the way married couples did. This created a sense of partnership, of building something together. But it also created vulnerability. If the relationship ended, one partner might be left with nothing. Edward Carpenter and George Merrill navigated this by putting everything in Carpenter's name legally, but treating everything as jointly owned in practice. Merrill contributed labor. He ran the household, tended the garden, managed daily operations. Carpenter provided the financial resources. They both understood this was a partnership, even though the law would never recognize it as such. Let us discuss what happened during the aging process. Because gay relationships did not end at 40. Men grew old together when they were lucky enough to stay together. Aging brought new challenges. Your physical desire might fade. Your health might decline. You became more dependent on each other. But you also had history. Years of shared experiences, inside jokes, rituals, a life built together in secret. For couples who had been together for decades, the relationship deepened in ways that transcended the physical. You knew each other completely. You had survived together. That created a bond that was hard to break. But aging also brought fear. What happens when one of you becomes ill? Who will care for you? You cannot go to a hospital together and expect to be treated as family. You cannot ask a doctor to give your partner information about your condition. Legally, you are nothing to each other. Some couples made provisions. They wrote wills leaving everything to the other person, disguised as bequests to a friend. They appointed each other as executors. They did everything possible within the legal system to protect each other. But the protections were fragile. Families could contest wills. They often did. When Edward Carpenter died in 1929, he left everything to George Merrill. The family did not contest it. But this was unusual. More often, families swooped in and took everything. The surviving partner was left with nothing, not even photographs. The family cleared out the house and erased every trace of the relationship. Imagine living with someone for 20 years and then having his family show up the day after he dies and tell you to leave, to take nothing, that you have no rights, that as far as they are concerned, you did not exist. This happened over and over. Some surviving partners fought back. They hired lawyers. They made the case that the deceased would have wanted them to inherit. Sometimes they won. More often, they lost. The law was not on their side. Others simply disappeared. After their partner died, they moved away, started over somewhere else. No one in the new place knew about their past. They lived out their final years alone, carrying their grief in silence. Let us talk about suicide, because it was common enough that it must be addressed. Gay men killed themselves at rates far higher than the general population. The reasons are obvious: the isolation, the shame, the constant fear, the loss of partners, the rejection by families, the impossibility of imagining a future. After Oscar Wilde was convicted, several men connected to the case killed themselves. The pressure was too much. They could not face the public exposure. They could not face prison. They could not face the destruction of their lives. So they chose death. Suicide was considered a sin by the church and a crime by the state. Bodies of suicides were not buried in consecrated ground. Families were shamed. But for some men, death felt like the only escape. Others survived suicidal periods and went on to build meaningful lives. John Addington Symonds wrote that he came close to killing himself multiple times in his 20s. He felt trapped. He was married to a woman he did not love. He desired men, but believed that desire was sinful. He could not see a way forward. What saved him was reading. He discovered the Greek philosophers. He read about ancient societies where love between men was accepted. He realized that his desires were not unprecedented, that other cultures, other times, had made space for men like him. This gave him hope. If it had been possible once, maybe it could be possible again. He began to see himself as part of a historical continuum. Men had loved men since the beginning of recorded history. The Victorians condemned it, but the Victorians were not eternal. Things could change. This belief kept him alive. Edward Carpenter made a similar argument in his writing. He urged gay men not to despair, to see themselves as pioneers, as people living ahead of their time. He argued that society would eventually catch up, that the laws would change, that future generations would look back at Victorian England and be horrified by how gay people were treated. He was right, but he did not live to see it. The laws in England did not change until 1967, nearly 40 years after his death. And even then, decriminalisation was partial. Full equality took another 50 years. For the men living in the Victorian era, Carpenter's optimism must have seemed naive. Change felt impossible. The laws were absolute. The church was immovable. Public opinion was hostile. How could any of that change? And yet, Carpenter kept arguing for hope. He kept writing. He kept living openly with George Merrill. He kept inviting gay men to visit and see that another way of life was possible. This mattered. Even if the laws did not change in his lifetime, he changed individual lives. He gave men hope. And hope, in a time of despair, is survival. Let us return to the question of what daily life looked like for gay couples who managed to stay together. Because between the dramatic moments, the arrests and trials and heartbreaks, there was ordinary life. You woke up. If you lived together, you ate breakfast. If you lived apart, you went to work knowing you would see each other that evening. You performed your job, whatever it was. You made small talk with colleagues. You pretended to be interested when they talked about their wives and children. You kept your own relationship hidden. At the end of the day, you met. Same place as always. You walked. You talked about your day, the petty annoyances at work, the neighbour who was too nosy, the leak in the roof that needed fixing, all the boring domestic concerns that fill any relationship. Then you went home, his place or yours. You ate dinner. You sat together. Maybe you read. Maybe you talked. Maybe you just sat in companionable silence. This was the bulk of the relationship, not the dramatic moments. Just time spent together. Just presence. Physical intimacy, when it happened, was woven into this ordinary life. Not every night. Not even most nights, for many couples. But regularly enough. You went to bed together. You held each other. You touched. You fell asleep in each other's arms. In the morning, you woke up. If anyone could see into the windows, you made sure there was space between you before you got out of bed. You dressed separately. You performed the fiction of two men who happened to share lodgings. Then the day began again. This routine was both comfort and constraint. The sameness felt safe. You knew what to expect. But it also meant you could never fully relax. Even in your own home, you had to be ready at any moment to make the relationship invisible. If someone knocked on the door unexpectedly, you had to be able to instantly shift into the performance of mere friendship. Some couples managed this for years, decades. They built entire lives around this double reality. They were partners in private and friends in public, and somehow they made it work. The key was trust, absolute trust. You had to know that your partner would never slip, never say the wrong thing, never let affection show in public. One mistake could destroy both of you. So you trusted each other completely, or the relationship could not survive. Let us talk about the rare moments of joy. Because they did exist. Despite everything, gay Victorian men found happiness. A weekend away together, if you could arrange it. Staying at a country inn where no one knew you. Registering as cousins or business partners. Having 2 days where you could walk hand in hand on a deserted beach. Where you could sit close together in the evening without fear. Where you could wake up in the morning and not have to immediately create distance between your bodies. These weekends were precious. You planned them carefully. You saved money for them. You told elaborate stories to cover your absence. And then you had 2 days of something approaching normalcy. 2 days of being a couple in public, or at least in semi-public. 2 days of not performing heterosexuality every second. Then, Monday came. You returned to London. You went back to hiding. But you had the memory. You had proof that a different life was possible, even if only for 48 hours. Holidays together were even rarer, but even more precious. If you could manage to travel abroad, spend a week in Paris or Rome, live openly for 7 days, walk through a foreign city arm in arm, sit at a cafe and gaze at each other without worry, kiss in a hotel room without wondering if the walls are too thin. John Addington Symonds wrote about a trip to Venice with a lover. They stayed in a small hotel. They took a gondola ride at sunset. They sat close together in the gondola, watching the light on the water. Symonds wrote that he felt for that one evening what it must be like to be free, to love openly, to not be afraid. The memory sustained him for months afterward. When things were difficult, when the hiding felt unbearable, he thought about that evening in Venice. He knew that somewhere, for some people, life could be different, and that knowledge gave him strength. These moments of joy were small and fleeting, but they mattered enormously. They were proof that the relationship was real, that it was not just about sex or fear or desperation, that you actually loved this person, that you chose each other, that you built something together that was worth protecting. Let us discuss the letters that did survive, because scholars have found hundreds of them over the last century. Letters between John Addington Symonds and various men. Letters between Edward Carpenter and George Merrill when they were apart. Letters found in attics and archives. Letters that somehow escaped destruction. These letters are remarkable documents. They show the emotional depth of these relationships. The writers express love openly because they assume the letters will be destroyed after reading. They say things they could never say aloud or in public. They describe physical longing. They make future plans. They express jealousy, affection, frustration, devotion, all the emotions that fill any intimate relationship. Reading them now, over a century later, is both moving and heartbreaking. Moving because the love is so evident. These men loved each other deeply and truly. Heartbreaking because they had to hide it. Because they could not celebrate it. Because they lived in constant fear of discovery. One letter from a man named William to his lover James, dated 1888, describes a dream. William dreamed they were walking together on a beach, and no one was watching. They held hands. They kissed in the sunlight. They laughed without fear. William woke up and realized it was just a dream. He wrote that he cried, not because he would never have that with James, but because they would never have it openly. They would always have to hide. The letter ends with William saying he would rather have James in secret than not have him at all, that the hiding was worth it, that James made his life worth living. It is signed, yours always. James kept that letter. He hid it inside a book. When he died in 1903, his sister found it while clearing out his rooms. She read it. She understood immediately what it meant, and instead of burning it, which would have been the expected response, she kept it. She put it in a box with other papers and eventually donated everything to an archive. She made a choice to preserve her brother's truth. That sister's name is lost to history. We do not know why she made that choice. Maybe she loved her brother enough to want his story told, eventually. Maybe she understood that love, any love, deserved to be remembered. Maybe she was quietly radical in ways her time would not have recognized. Whatever her reason, she gave us this glimpse into James and William's relationship. She refused to let them be erased. Let us talk about legacy. Because these men left almost nothing behind. No legal documents acknowledging their relationships. No photographs of them together, or at least none labelled honestly. No graves that named them as partners. The historical record tried to erase them completely, but they could not erase everything. The letters that survived. The trial transcripts that documented their existence even as they condemned it. The memoirs written in private and discovered later. The poetry published under pseudonyms. The coded references in published work. All of this adds up to proof. They existed. They loved. They built relationships despite impossible odds. Modern LGBTQ people owe them an enormous debt. They survived so that we could exist. They refused to disappear even when everything in their society demanded it. They loved each other in the dark so that someday their descendants could love in the light. When you attend a pride parade today, you are walking in their footsteps. When you hold your partner's hand in public without fear, you are living the dream they could barely imagine. When you marry your same-sex partner legally, you are doing something they would have considered miraculous. They would be astonished by the world we live in now. The laws have changed. The church is changing. Slowly. Public opinion has shifted dramatically. What was a crime in 1895 is a constitutional right in many countries today. What was considered a disease is understood as a natural variation. What was hidden is now, in many places, celebrated. This did not happen automatically. It took over a century of activism. It took people like Edward Carpenter, who lived openly even when it was dangerous. It took people who rioted at Stonewall. It took activists who fought for every inch of progress. It took people dying of AIDS while the government ignored them. It took decades of slow, painful work. But it started with the Victorian men who refused to be alone, who found each other in parks and theatres and public toilets, who built relationships in secret, who loved each other despite the law. They planted seeds that took 100 years to grow. But they grew. Let us think about what dating means now versus what it meant for them. You open an app. You see hundreds of potential partners. You swipe, you message, you meet for coffee. If it does not work out, you try again. The ease is almost unimaginable compared to what they endured. You do not have to learn a code. You do not have to wonder if the person you are attracted to is gay. You do not have to risk arrest just for expressing interest. You do not have to rent a room by the hour. You do not have to burn every letter. You do not have to hide your relationship from everyone you know. This is progress. Real, tangible progress. And it is worth celebrating. But it is also worth remembering the cost. The thousands of men who were arrested, imprisoned, destroyed. The relationships that ended because the pressure was too great. The men who killed themselves because they could not bear the isolation. The families that were torn apart. The love that was never acknowledged or honoured. We live in a better world now. But we got here on the backs of people who suffered, people who did not have what we have, people who loved anyway. If you are a gay person reading this or listening to this as you fall asleep, take a moment to think about them. The Victorian men who met in secret, who kissed in the dark, who held each other knowing it could be the last time, who built relationships that the law would not recognize and history tried to erase. They are your ancestors, not biologically necessarily, but spiritually. They are the reason you can exist openly. They refused to disappear, and their refusal made space for you. And if you are not gay, think about them too. Think about what it means to love someone when the entire world tells you that love is wrong. Think about the courage it took to meet someone in a park at midnight, to write a letter you knew you would have to burn, to say I love you to another man when those words could send you to prison. That is courage. That is resistance. That is human beings refusing to let cruelty define them. The Victorian era ended in 1901. The laws against homosexuality remained on the books in England until 1967. That is 66 years into the 20th century. Men were still being arrested, still going to prison, still losing everything. The world Oscar Wilde lived in did not die with him. It persisted for decades. But it did eventually change. The activists kept pushing. The culture slowly shifted. And now, in 2024, you can marry your same-sex partner in dozens of countries. You can adopt children. You can serve openly in the military. You can be gay and be a teacher, a politician, a celebrity. None of this was imaginable in Victorian England. Edward Carpenter believed it was possible. He did not live to see it. But he believed. He wrote that future generations would look back on Victorian sexual morality and be baffled by it, that the idea of criminalizing love would seem barbaric, that people would wonder how society ever justified such cruelty. He was right. We do look back in bafflement. We do see it as barbaric. We do wonder how it was ever justified. But we also know that the work is not finished. There are still places where being gay is illegal, where gay people are executed, where pride parades are banned and gay relationships are criminalized. The Victorian world still exists in parts of our modern world. The fight is not over, which means that the courage of Victorian gay men is still relevant. Their refusal to be erased is still an example. Their determination to love despite everything is still a model. We need their memory. We need to know their names. We need to tell their stories. So let us say their names one more time. Oscar Wilde, Edward Carpenter, George Merrill, John Addington Symonds, Charles Keynes Jackson, John Gambrell Nicholson, Robert and Charles, who wrote each other love letters, John and Arthur, who met every Thursday for 10 years, William and James, who dreamed of walking on a beach holding hands, all the unnamed men in the trial transcripts, all the telegraph boys and sailors and factory workers and clerks and teachers who loved each other in secret. They lived. They loved. They mattered. Their relationships were not perfect. Some were exploitative. Some were unhealthy. Some were marked by the same jealousy and pettiness and dysfunction that marks heterosexual relationships. They were human. They made mistakes. They hurt each other, sometimes. This is not hagiography. This is history. But they also built something real. In the cracks of a hostile society, they found each other. They created intimacy. They gave each other comfort. They loved. And love, even hidden love, even illegal love, even love that society tried to destroy, is still love. It still matters. It still has value. When you fall asleep tonight, think about them. The men who loved in the dark, who met in secret, who wrote letters they had to burn, who built lives together that no one acknowledged. They did not have what you have, but they paved the way for you to have it. They are why pride exists. They are why marriage equality exists. They are why you can hold your partner's hand on the street without being arrested. They are why gay people can build visible, open, celebrated lives. Every right you have, they fought for, often without knowing they were fighting, often just by existing, by refusing to be alone, by loving anyway. So tonight, as you drift off, spare a thought for the Victorian gay couples who navigated London in the 1880s and 1890s. For the men who wore green carnations. For the men who met at the Alhambra Theatre. For the men who rented rooms by the hour. For the men who walked on Hampstead Heath at dusk. For the men who wrote letters beginning with, "My dear friend," and ending with, "Yours always." For the men who went to prison. For the men who survived. For the men who did not. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. Your support means everything. May your dreams be free of secret codes and rented rooms and the constant fear of discovery. May you dream of a world where love, any love, is celebrated. Where two people who find each other can simply be together without hiding. Where the only question that matters is whether you make each other happy. That world is closer now than it was in Victorian England, but it is still not fully here. So may you dream, too, of the work still to be done, of the places where people are still hiding, of the future where no one has to hide anymore. Good night, and sleep well.